Okay, welcome to my fifth iteration of the church history class. We had the world Jesus was born into, the world of Jesus and the apostles in the first century. Then we had the 100s, the 200s, and now we are into the 300s. All of these are available on the website, which I will again send this out, and it's tfc.org or st.com. The third century, the three major things, is a Christian Roman Empire. Something that was unfathomable by the apostles when the Gospels first came. We're going to go over that. The second is the Fathers. It's a unique series of bishops who helped create this Christian Roman Empire, standing up to the civil authorities and standing up people who were false teachers. The Bible. The Bible was created in the third century. It's a fascinating story. And finally, the political upheaval. Last when we saw the height of the Roman Empire, it's starting to come down, and the third century really speeds that up. A Christian Roman Empire. It is almost impossible to imagine just how incredible and possibly traumatic the fourth century was for Christians. It began during the worst and most aggressive persecutions under Diocletian and ended with Christianity being the official religion of the empire and the pagans being persecuted, although generally not violently. The Christians slowly converted the people around them with their example and teaching. Christian bishops stood up to secular leaders and false teachers, and the church organized itself and became a solid institution in the face of a collapsing empire. This really happened first with Constantine, the first Christian Roman Empire. He was actually raised, there was the two rulers that they had, and their way of keeping peace was that they would swap their sons. His father was an emperor or a leader in the West, and he was sent to Constantinople. And if he did anything wrong, the other guy had his son, and he could kill him or do whatever. So it was a way of making sure that everybody played fair. So Constantine grew up with the Eastern Roman emperor, but was really a Westerner. And he becomes, at some point, is finally proclaimed the head of the army by his troops in Britain. And on his way down, and the way you took Rome, or the way you became the emperor, was you took it. You crossed and you went into the city and you seized it. And if you could hold it, you were the next Caesar. There was no clean line of succession. As he's coming down to take over and become the head of the Western Empire, he sees this sign in the sky with the words, "In hoc signo vinces." In this sign, you will conquer. He paints it on all covers his shields in it, and they march into battle with this Christian symbol, and they're victorious. And he establishes the Edict of Milan in 313, where Christianity is officially publicly tolerated. You were allowed to be a Christian publicly in the empire. It's the first time. He was not the best example of a Christian. He was only baptized on his deathbed, but what he did was opened the door for Christianity to become a public cult in the empire. There are other emperors in between here and now. I'm only going to cover the biggest ones. Christianity begins to spread, and again, Christians become a more public figure, and Christian worship becomes more public. This is probably what he actually saw, as opposed to the famous cross thing there. Julian the Apostate. This is an interesting thing because as Christianity is getting closer and closer and gaining more and more strength, the devil gets one last curveball in there. He was educated in Greek philosophy. He was a great military man. There are actually almost no photos of him in military garb because he was so known to be a philosopher. But he felt that Christianity had weakened the Roman Empire and had started to cause its fall. Interestingly enough, many centuries from now, in 1776, Edward Gibbon writes The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire and agrees with Julian the Apostate that the empire fell because Christianity weakened it, which was about forgiving your enemies, not about conquering them. He launches a severe persecution of Christians, which was quite shocking. He, however, dies very quickly in battle, and so it was a horrible chapter. It doesn't last very long. Theodosius the Great is the last. It's up to 395, so over the very end of the 300s, he officially establishes Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the Edict of Thessalonica in 380. So by 380, it is no longer tolerated. It's now the official religion of the Roman Empire. One of the things that brought this about was something called fathers. And fathers is a particular term referring to bishops who stood up to secular leaders, stood up to false teachers, and articulated and wrote about how to understand and how to navigate the Christian faith in the face of both Judaism and paganism. We've covered some of that already, but there's several fathers. As societal changes, doctrinal challenges, and ecclesiastical challenges rocked the church, bishops stood up and defended the doctrine, practice, and worship of the church, and they came to be called fathers. There were many valiant fathers, but two main groups, one Greek and one Latin. Those are the two sides of the empire. Some of the most notable fathers were. In the East, there were several Greek fathers. I mean, there's actually more in the East because of all the intellectual debates and theological things rolling around than there were in the West. The East dealt with more theological controversy, so there are more opportunities for heroic bishops to stand up. This particular icon is famous of the three holy hierarchs, St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil, and St. Gregory Nazianzen. St. John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople, preached very eloquently. Chrysostom literally means golden mouth. Denounced worldliness at the court and heresy within the church. He was very aggressive at denouncing the worldliness in the church and ended up getting exiled by the queen, who just got tired of being pestered about how fancy she dressed. I'm not even kidding. I don't think she was even living immorally. It was just a very sumptuous court, and he railed about, the famous saying of, if you the coat you have hanging in your closet that you do not wear belongs to the poor man who is cold. It's his. So very, very, very strict moral code that they laid down there. St. John Chrysostom is mostly known for his theology of the Eucharist and his theology and ecclesiastical theology, less so than actual heretical debates or anything. St. Gregory Nazianzen, again, mostly known for his ecclesiastical theology, was Archbishop of Constantinople and a great defender of the faith. I don't remember exactly what things he was after, but he's very well known for just in general defending the faith. Basil the Great, Bishop of Caesarea and Cappadocia, he was a great defender of the faith, also standing up against those who would oppose it. One of his key things was the organizer of monasticism. In the East, monasticism, and I'm going to cover in the 400s, we're going to cover more on developments of monasticism. But in the East, monasticism was a very alone thing. You went off, you were by yourself, physically austere, etc., and it grew like wildfire. He was the one that kind of organized it in the East into more houses, and was able to wrote a rule about it, which still stands to this day. He wrote his own rule, which became the standard for Greek Christianity of monks. Athanasius, the most intrepid defender of orthodoxy against Arianism. Athanasius was Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, which labored long and hard against the Arian influences in the imperial court and in the church. Exiled a number of times. He stood up and defended. We'll cover that in the next thing. I'm going to cover some more of this against how he and went against. And this isn't your random Arian wandering around. This is like the Archbishop of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Emperor kind of thing. And he was intrepid defender of it. Again, exiled and chased around. There are tales of him where they're coming to kill him, and he on the boat and has to hide, or at one point doesn't hide. He says, if God wants me, and they drove right by and didn't recognize him. So a number of miracles attributed to Athanasius in his defense of and his persecution against Arianism. Cyril of Alexandria was a great defender against Nestorianism, which is kind of the opposite. Arianism says that Jesus was human and not really divine, very close to the divine, but a human. Nestorius says that he was divine and wasn't human. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Another patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril, combated the views of Nestorius, who was patriarch of Constantinople. So the very height of the Eastern Church, and taught a version of Nestorianism. He was president of the First Council of Constantinople, and I'll cover the councils next time we do this. There's seven ecumenical councils. I'll go through each one and how they worked. In the West, there were the fathers were more. Some of the stuff bled down from the east to the west, but the West was a little bit different, and the fathers who stood up did so differently. Ambrose. Ambrose was unique. He was not a clergyman when he was made bishop. In fact, he hadn't been baptized. He was a catechumen learning about the faith and was a local senator, and the bishop was killed or died somehow, and they were looking for his successor. And as legend has it, a young child yelled, "Ambrose, bishop," and everybody thought, yes, that's what we want. Ambrose is not having any of it, took off. And again, legend has it he was actually in a chariot or cart on his way out the city, and they had to knock him over, grab him and drag him back and put him through in one day. I think it was the whole thing was in 1 week. It was several things. All the things up to the priesthood, up to the bishopric in basically one day. So he was dragged from the secular senatorial life, so to speak, to becoming the bishop of Milan. Ambrose in the West was very, very effective at really establishing the church's rights. Ambrose resisted the worldly princes of the day, thus enforced the authority of the church. He was also an articulate preacher, attracted more educated men to Christianity, including Augustine. When the first apostles first came down, they were generally speaking not especially educated men. Educated men came into Christianity and such. But Ambrose was notable because he actually brought the rhetoric and such of the Latin world into his sermons and wrote very articulately. And men like Augustine, who were fairly proud of themselves, were impressed by his style of preaching. Famous scene here they have is Theodosius, who we covered before, was the emperor who established Christianity, who tended to, in this case, he had gone off and made war on someone much weaker than he, and such. And Ambrose walked out with this thing and stopped him. He says, "You will not walk into church till you've done penance for what you did." And actually confronted the emperor and would not let him into church until he'd done penance for a sin that he'd had. That was the level of authority of the church that Ambrose was effective in upholding. Augustine. Most history classes actually will spend an entire course on him. I'm not going to. But I will cover him in a bit here. Augustine is a key and central figure in Western Christianity as far as both a conversion story, a saint, and a philosopher. Augustine was born to a Christian mother and pagan father and raised up very intelligent man, studied Latin rhetoric and was educated also, but also a very immoral man. Chased women everywhere, was all caught up, had numerous mistresses, ended up living with a woman on and on. He all along, he kept searching for truth. He wanted to find truth, and even though his flesh was weak, he kept seeking truth. And the famous thing was that he began to sit for schools of philosophy. He heard Ambrose preach. He was getting into studying, and he had a little group of men who would get together and talk philosophy. He wanted to convert, but he felt too weak. And of course, the famous saying, "O Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." Finally, he realized that he had to become strong enough and to overcome. And he was wandering along saying, "Oh Lord, why are men who are far less intelligent than I able to conquer themselves and I can't do it?" And he heard a little boy supposedly singing, "Tolle lege, take and read." And he walked over and grabbed what happened to be New Testament there, opened up to St. Paul's epistle, and I don't actually remember exactly where it is right now. It basically says, cease chambering, cease running around, cease living a lascivious life, put ye on the Lord Jesus. And as he read that, he found the strength to be able to turn his life over and to pursue virtue. One of the most famous sayings, "Our hearts were made for thee, O Lord, and they are restless until they rest in thee," the saying that he wrote. Augustine combined a deep philosophical mind with a deeply religious one. He steered the church through several controversies by his penetrating intellect. St. Augustine really had a training in philosophy that few before him had, and was able to argue and quote and such the pagan philosophers extremely well and tie them in, so that anybody who brought an argument to him, he was able to, oftentimes through their own writings, to be able to argue on where they were weak and where Christianity was right. He is held, generally speaking, as the key Western mind before St. Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas quotes Augustine more than anybody else. So he was also, again, very profoundly devout. he, and I'll cover this more next time, actually helped establish Western monasticism in many ways. He had his clergy live around him in the cathedral, and they were referred to as canons. It was the standard by all their clergy should be judged, but he would train them in everything else, and this kind of life lived in common became very common for monks in the West. Jerome, the scholar of language. Jerome's a very interesting man. He began as a priest. He was fluent in Latin and Greek, learned Hebrew, and actually began some Aramaic and Syriac in his love of the scriptures and things like that. And found that he was living in Rome and was involved in the project of working with the scriptures, almost became a cardinal to assist the Pope, but quite honestly, he was a pain. He was short-spoken. He would get after people. He was intolerant of some of the worldliness around him. He got into several fights, one of which was with Ambrose. It actually insults Ambrose in one of his letters there because he was such an austere and somewhat grouchy man. Finally decided he couldn't live in Rome, what was going on there, went to Jerusalem and founded a monastery there and lived in a semi-hermit life in Jerusalem, again, still working on the Bible. And here's the more austere version of him living in Jerusalem in a cell. Ended up living life. It's fascinating. When I was studying Latin, reading between Augustine and Jerome's Latin is amazing. First, it's very hard to get the hang of it. Like, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. But he was an excellent writer. We actually almost have more writings from him than most other fathers. They're just not very well known because they're mostly about scriptural commentary and is going through and reading the scriptures and talking about where the book comes from, its background, and things like that. They're not philosophical, so they don't get the attention that Augustine's gets. Pope Leo the Great, a pope. Pope Leo wrote a number of things and was certainly involved in the early parts of the church in establishing the strength of both the church in general and the papacy in Rome. One of the things he's most known for was his coming out and confronting Attila the Hun, walking out there as this invading army is coming in there, and Leo stands out there and says, "No, you're not going to enter here. You will not come into this. Gandalf, you shall not pass," kind of a thing. Attila turned around and did not take Rome. And there was a rumor, and who knows, he says that Attila saw over his head Saints Peter and Paul with a sword and what have you, and he knew that he was the power of God was behind him. So Pope Leo, again, the defense of the temporal and spiritual authority of the church. I already had that. He was very involved in the controversies and the going on in the East. He met Attila the Hun at the gates of Rome and threatened him if he invaded the holy city. One of the key things here is the church's teaching is a monolith. The church comes together and it agrees on things and slowly but surely builds up this set of established teachings in something called councils. I'm not going to cover it this time. I have too many other things to do, but they begin in the end of the 300s. Again, Christian Roman Empire. You're going to begin to have these councils. The church is going to sit down and is going to start making decisions and clarifying the faith. The creeds are going to start developing from these kind of things. I'm going to cover them extensively in the next class because most of them happen. They happen all continuing on, but I will cover them extensively in the next class. But it really establishes the teachings of the church very monolithic as far as discipline and formation. The Bible. One of the most important things that happened in the 3rd century was the creation of an official copy of the scriptures. The scriptures were the preeminent concern for the early church. The chronicle of God's revelation to man. The problem lay that there were many texts from many sources. There was the Hebrew text, actually a few versions of the Hebrew text. There was an Aramaic and Syriac texts created during the exile. And then there was the Septuagint, the copy of the Greek scriptures that was so influential in making Judaism and Christianity known and understood in the Hellenistic world. The problem, these texts did not all agree. The Hebrew texts mostly agreed, and the differences were often not text critical. It wasn't major things. It was addition of he said or an and, or it were minor. Most were minorly and really didn't affect the meaning of the texts. The Aramaic and Syriac texts generally agreed, but they were not accepted by the Hebrew-speaking population of Israel, basically because they were not written in Hebrew. They were during the exile when people who were away from they'd grown up speaking something else, continued to write. There were also prophecies and such. But many Jews and many in the early Christian church did not see any reason for the snobbery and read the text. So they were important, but how? And then the Septuagint contained a number of differences, text critical differences. This was a real conundrum for the increasingly united church who wanted to speak with one voice and read one scriptures. Which version should hold sway? This is where Jerome and Augustine really had a fight. Jerome, and there's more on the next slide, but I'm going to set up a little bit here. Jerome was a scholar of the texts. He had the ancient texts, and he felt that the antiquity of the text should hold, and that you should find the purest one based on, and again, he read them well, so he'd look at, okay, the general consensus is this, or what have you. Where Augustine was much more practical. What are the people reading? The fact that the Gospels and the Septuagint were both in Greek was a key factor here. The fact that they were both the Hebrew, but the fact that you had these texts already in Greek, which were common and circulating around, was a key to deciding factor. The fact that both books, the Gospels and the Septuagint, were in Greek gave preference to the Septuagint over the Hebrew. Also, the Hellenic world had been reading the Septuagint for at least 200 years, so to introduce changes would be difficult. Still, Jerome argued that the Hebrew text should stand. The Hebrew was the more ancient text. Again, it was also more continuous. All the versions came together and showed a much more continuous trend of a message. Augustine argued the Greek text should stand. Any changes or differences should be seen as, well, God changed his mind. In the end, it was the Greek that won out because of the fact that the entire Hellenic world knew that text. The Gospels and the Septuagint were so common, the Greek won out. Going forward, the Greek text trumped the Hebrew. This will also come back to really bite the church when the Reformation comes down, even in England. They'll go back to the Hebrew. And they'll start looking. That's why our psalms are numbered differently than Roman Catholics are, and why you'll often find little differences in our text as opposed to theirs, is because of the fact that we went back to the Hebrew and almost weighted the Hebrew more than the Greek. Yes?
I even heard there's even one legend that says that Luther himself actually wanted to take out the entire book of James.
Right. Well, that was a theological reason, but yes, you are correct. We'll get to that in a few centuries down the road. Do we add the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical books? The apocryphal books, as St. Jerome says, and this actually is quoted later on in the 39 Articles, the church reads for examples in life and instruction in good behavior. It does not use them to establish any doctrine. The Apocrypha in particular, those books which were not written in Hebrew, but were considered part of the Hebrew Bible. Daniel, there's Tobit, there's Judith, there's a few of them, I don't remember all of them. And then there are pieces and parts of books that they came back from the exile, either Aramaic or Syria, depending on which exile you're talking. The two different groups that both came back, two different languages. There were prophecies, there were things that had been written, commentaries that had been written and things like that. And these books came back and they were not in Hebrew, and so they were not part of that Bible. The church decided to bring them in. Now, Rome, at some point in time, they all just became part of Holy Scripture and they stopped distinguishing them. When the reformers come down, especially England, says, well, let's let people know what this is. There's a little bit of history behind it. There's no point in just shoving it all under one cover. So they separate them. But up until, I think, almost America, every Anglican Bible contained the Apocrypha as well as the traditional 66, 73 as opposed to 66. Also here was the Latin Vulgate. The western side of the church did not really speak Latin or speak Greek. Augustine apparently was terrible at it, even though he was part of the argument as far as the Bible was concerned. The western half of the empire spoke Latin, so there was also a need for a single authoritative edition in the Latin language. Political upheavals and the barbarians. As the Roman Empire became weaker, the Germanic peoples on the frontier of the empire began to make inroads into the empire and to become part of the fabric of the empire, to be utilized in the army and as slaves. These people were called barbarians, not as is often claimed that they spoke gibberish. Frankly, ba 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 sounds more like Latin than it does German, but because they did not have the similar hygiene habits in the Greco-Roman world. That is, they did not shave their faces and their bodies. Barbar means beard in Latin. Barbar simply means hairy. So you'll see a lot of people say that ba 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 was the language was indistinguishable. The truth of the matter is the word Barbara means something. It means hairy. And people, we saw this in Ben-Hur from the bath, they would shave their bodies. It was considered to be proper hygiene for civilized people was to shave the bodies, and the barbarians did not. So that does not mean that they were, I mean, obviously the term barbarian oftentimes was taken to mean violent, but the original term of barbarian simply means someone who doesn't shave, they're hairy. Over the course of the 300s, this is not the best image. It's hard to find them sometimes. They were around the borders of the empire, but by the year 300, we talked about how the social concern and care, that there wasn't as much of a civic duty or anything, fewer people in the military and such. And so they began to conscript Germans from these areas out living here, the Saxons, the Franks, the Visigoths and Ostrogoths. You can see Visigoths in Spain, Visi meaning Western Goth, and you can see Ostrogoths in, it says Visigoth as well, but out there up higher, Ostrogoths, Ostra meaning east, so the Eastern Western Goths. And slowly but surely they began conscripting, getting them in the army, so that as the century went along, the army began to look very different beginning in the 300s. The Celts, Ostrogoths or Eastern Goths, Visigoths or Western Goths, and Vandals all began to be enlisted by the Romans to defend the empire that once tried to keep them out. So that and that's not very good, you can see how much the Roman army begins to change as the 300s rolls along into the 400s. Before you had very Roman-looking things, the legions begin looking less and less necessarily Roman, although they would still consider themselves to be Roman emperors. Conversions and baptisms. Many of these Germanic tribes which came by waves into the empire were baptized and became apostles, which in the next century would take the gospel to the north. I'm missing an E there. So one of the things about as this comes in here, is the Roman Empire is now Christian, so in a sense the work is somewhat done in that regard, but the northern countries really have not been evangelized yet. So these Germans coming into the empire and learning Latin and learning their ways and becoming baptized would then turn around in the following centuries, take the gospel up, and you begin to have the Germanic peoples be converted by people who knew their language and understood their culture. All right, next time here, the glory of imperial Christianity and the beginning of the end. I want to talk about how really, this is the beginning of a two-part thing of how the East and the West really separates, and what the vision of what Christianity looks like in the empire. Western monasticism is going to be a very different thing from Eastern monasticism. Eastern monasticism, as we saw, where you're living alone, very physically austere, you're mostly reciting prayers you've memorized by yourself, you eat once, maybe twice a week, drink water once a day at best. When they get to the West, they really have no taste for that at all. If you begin to have people living in communities, singing psalms together, eating at table together with readings, very, very different cultural understanding of what monasticism means. They say silence will take over where physical austerity, where solitude will be replaced by silence, and physical austerity replaced by obedience. So the Western monasticism will look very different. And I'm going to cover at length the councils. There's 7 general councils which go into these arguments over the questions of Arianism, the questions of Nestorianism, and all these various issues that have been rocking. I covered today the fathers of the church, these men that stood up and argued. We'll go next time into more specifically what and how. And you can see some of the terms you're familiar with and the creeds you're familiar with, how they were formed at that point in time. All right. Any questions? Nope. All right. All right. Very good. Thank you.